Welcome to episode 17 of the Thoughts with Lakshman podcast. In this episode of the podcast, we're going to be discussing the bombing of Dresden, mainly looking at it from a German perspective. Um, in my podcast, I focus on German cultural topics and studying German as a society, systems that are in place, and comparing them to the United States to really see the differences between our culture and theirs, our systems and theirs, whether it's education or government or anything really. I've also focused a few episodes on more artistic things like architecture and more on traditions. But yeah, that's really what we focus on in the podcast. My podcast is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. It's even on YouTube. It's called the Thoughts with Lakshman podcast. But yeah, let's get straight into it. So in this episode, we're going to be focusing on the bombing of Dresden. Now, from February 13th to February 15th, 1945, right? Final months of World War II. This is when the Allied forces bombed, the historic city of Dresden, which is located in eastern Germany. Now, the bombing was controversial because Dresden was neither important to Germany, German wartime production, nor really a major industrial center. And before the massive air raid of February 1945, it had not really suffered a major Allied attack. By February 15th, the city was really, smoldered with ruin and an unknown number of civilians, and it's estimated between 22,700 to 25,000 were dead. So let's just start with a bit of background on the bombing of Dresden. So by February 1945, the jaws of the Allied vies were closed, shut on Nazi Germany. And in the West, Nazi leader Adolf Hitler began his desperate counteroffensive against the Allies in Belgium's Ardennes forest, and that really ended in total failure. In the east, the Red Army had captured East Prussia and reached the Oder River, which is less than 50 miles from Berlin. The once proud Luftwaffe was really a skeleton of an air fleet, and the Allies ruled the skies over Europe, dropping thousands of tons of bombs on Germany every day. Um, and actually, a Russian leader today, Vladimir Putin, he was actually a KGB spy stationed in Dresden during the late 1980s. I thought that was interesting. Just as a fun fact, I included it. But from February 4th to February 11th, the Big Three, or the Allied leaders, US President Franklin Roosevelt, British PM Winston Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, met at Yalta in the USSR, the Soviet Union, and they compromised, on their visions of the post-war world. Other than deciding on what, German territory would be conquered by which power, little time was given to military conversations in the war against the Third Reich. However, that Churchill and Roosevelt did, promise Stalin to continue their bombing campaign against Eastern Germany in preparation, for the advancing Soviet forces. Important aspect of the Allied air war against Germany involved what is known as an area or saturation bombing. In area bombing, all enemy industry, not just war munitions, is targeted, and civilian proportions of cities are obliterated along with troop areas. Now, before the invention, the atomic bomb, the invention of the atomic bomb, cities were most effectively destroyed, through the use of incendiary bombs that caused naturally fierce fires in the enemy cities. In such attacks, Allied commanders really reasoned would ravage the German economy, and thus it would break the morale. of the German people and force an early surrender. I mean, now this is really where it gets complicated. This is the crux of the issue. And it's really the debate whether, the bombing of Dresden was justified. Because from a German perspective, they're saying, why would you bomb us? They're only civilians here. It's not involved in industry. It's not involved in wartime production. So it doesn't make, logical sense, I guess, to say that they felt that it didn't make sense to bomb Dresden. Um, and they have a point. The only people that really died in the bombing of Dresden were civilians who had nothing to do with the war. And you don't want to kill civilians, right? In the war, you're not. That's not the goal. That's bad. And you don't want to just for pointlessly just destroy, you know, cities when when those cities are not related to the war effort. But then on the other hand, the United States argued that their strategy of area bombing by just taking out, cities and civilian areas, it would hurt the German morale for the war, which would affect their effort. And this is where it gets interesting because yes, they do have a point. Obviously, it would affect, their morale if you just destroyed an entire city. But then again, right? They're not really fighting their civilians. You're killing innocent people. You're destroying a city pointlessly, and that's where it gets interesting on whether, um, you know, it's reasonable to their actions were reasonable. And in my opinion, I think it's interesting. I think to the extent that which Dresden was destroyed was bad. I don't think I think they could have done it in a much they shouldn't have gone as far as they did. And I think that's bad because so many people were killed and so many innocent people were killed. And that's going to happen in war just because it is war. But, we shouldn't be targeting innocent people. If it happens accidentally, and not like accidentally, but if you're trying to take out, war people, soldiers or something, or generals, and and you also take out civilians, though not intentionally, and that's not your goal, then that's not as bad as targeting civilians, which is very unethical. And that's what Germans argued. But yeah, let's get deeper into it. But that's just my opinion on that. So Germany was the first, to employ area bombing tactics during its assault on Poland. So it's a little hypocritical from a German perspective. Um, during the Battle of Britain, they targeted London and other heavily populated areas with area bombing attacks. Um, but stung, but unbowed. The Royal Air Force, avenged the bombings of London and Coventry in 1942 and launched, the first of many, saturation bombing attacks against Germany. And in 1944, Hitler named the world's first long-range, offensive missile, V1, and that was named after the German word for vengeance, and an expression of his desire to really repay Britain for its devastating bombardment of Germany, which is very, very interesting. The fact that they name a missile, and the purpose of, really they name the missile after to destroy Britain. And the Allies never overtly admitted that they were engaged in saturation bombing. Specific military targets were announced in relation to every attack. However, it was but a veneer, and few mourned the destruction of German cities that built, the weapons and bred the soldiers that by 1945 had killed more than 10 million Allied soldiers and even more civilians. And the firebombing of Dresden would really prove an exception to this rule. Now, before World War II, Dresden was called, the Florence of the Elbe, and was really regarded as one of the world's most beautiful cities, for its architecture and museums and just overall. Now, although no German city remained isolated um, from Hitler's war machine. Dresden's contribution to the war effort was really minimal compared with other German cities. In February 1945, refugees fleeing the Russian advance in the east, took refuge there. And, as Hitler had thrown much of his surviving forces into a defense of Berlin in the north, city defenses were minimal. And the Russians would have had little trouble capturing Dresden, and it really seemed an unlikely target, for a major Allied air attack because Germany wasn't really they didn't really protect Dresden as much as they could have, but their reasoning was that, why should we protect Dresden if we're not really doing anything there? It's not like other cities where okay, we're building our war supplies and we got to protect them, but there's nothing really going. Dresden's not really involved in the war, so why do we have to protect it? That was kind of Germany's attitude. You can argue whether that was right or wrong. I think they're right in that they didn't have to protect it as they did other cities, but um, yeah, it's very interesting. On the night of February 13th, hundreds of RAF bombers descended on Dresden in two waves, dropping their lethal cargo indiscriminately over the city. And the city's air defenses were so weak yet that only six of the bombers were shot down. And by the morning, some 800 British bombers had dropped more than 1,400 tons of high explosive bombs and more than 1,100 tons of incendiaries on Dresden, which really created a great firestorm that destroyed most of the city, but more importantly, killed numerous innocent civilians. And later that day, survivors made their way out of the smoldering city. More than 300 U.S. bombers began, bombing Dresden's railways, bridges, and transportation facilities, killing thousands more. And on February 15th, another 200 U.S. bombers continued their assault on the city's infrastructure. And really, all told, um, the bombers of the U.S. 8th Air Force dropped more than 950 tons of high explosive bombs and more than 290 tons of incendiaries on Dresden. And later, the 8th Air Force would drop 2,800 more tons of bombs on Dresden in three other attacks before the war's end. So let's now focus on the aftermath of the bombing of Dresden. So the Allies claimed that by bombing Dresden, they were disrupting important lines of communication that would have hindered the Soviet offensive. Those are the official, the quotes. And while this might be true, um, there's not really any disputing that the British incendiary attack, on Dresden was really conducted to primarily for the purpose of terrorizing the German population and forcing an early surrender. And that's where it gets really interesting, right? Where you can argue, is that fair? Is that an ethical thing to do in war? It gets interesting. Ultimately, you want to win a war at all costs, but you have to be able to draw the line. Um, it should be noted that Germany, unlike Japan later in the year, did not surrender, until nearly the last possible moment, when its capital had fallen and Hitler was dead. And um, yeah, and because there were an unknown number of refugees in Dresden at the time of the Allied attack. It's really impossible to know exactly how many civilians perished. Um, you know, After the war, investigators from various countries with varying political motives calculated the number of civilians, but the data ranges a lot. Some studies say 8,000 were killed, some say more than 200,000. In 2010, the city of Dresden published an estimate of 25,000. And you'd think that seems like, a bit lower than some studies. and it's from the city of Dresden itself. So you would think that that's relatively accurate. But at the end of the war, Dresden was so badly damaged that the city was basically leveled. A handful of historic buildings, the Swinger Palace, the Dresden State Opera House, and several fine churches were carefully reconstructed out of the rubble. But the rest of the city was really rebuilt with plain modern buildings. And I actually have a podcast on German architecture, and I spent a lot of the podcast talking about the impact of the world wars because Germany's famous for its classical historical architecture, but a lot of it was destroyed during World War One and World War Two. And after World War One and World War Two, while some of it was they tried to rebuild it using the same style to really replace it seamlessly. A lot of it was replaced with modern architecture that was quite unpopular among many people. And that's another thing that's not really spoken about much. Obviously, you focus more about the lives lost in the war, but the architecture and the classical architecture that Germany was once, they're still famous for it because they still have they have many beautiful churches and castles and buildings, but it was much more widespread before both world wars. You know, and and yeah, and for example, American author Kurt Vonnegut, who was a prisoner of war in Dresden during the Allied attack, and tackled, the controversial event in his book Slaughterhouse-Five, which I've read. And it's a great book. I highly recommend it. He described, post-war Dresden. I included his quote. He said, "It looked a lot like Dayton, Ohio. More open spaces than Dayton has. There must be tons of human bone meal in the ground." So yeah, but though that's really I wanted to spend the first half of the podcast, or a bit more than half, maybe first two-thirds of the podcast, discussing just the events of Dresden. Now let's do a bit more analysis, you know, with um, with more personal perspective from Vonnegut and stuff like that in the second half of the podcast. Um, but yeah, so and it's important to remember, right? There are American prisoners of war who heard, Dresden's fire sirens howl and they described it, like Vonnegut says that German guards moved, 2 stories down into a meat locker. When they came back to the surface, the city was gone. And, and that's incredible to think that, they tell you to like, go down, take cover because you're getting bombed. And you come back after the bombing, maybe after a few hours, and the fact that the city's gone, that's incredible and it's scary. And it just goes to show, right, the power of these weapons during war and why you try to avoid war at all costs. And remember, this is before atomic bombs. These are just many bomber planes, British bomber planes from Lancaster that just flew over and dropped many bombs. This isn't atomic bombs can do even more than this, and that's why really war. You really want to try countries really try to avoid war at all costs. And I don't think we'll see another major world war in the future because of this. And if we did, it would be really, really dangerous for many innocent civilians because the power of the weapons nowadays, because this now, like today, this is 70, 80 years after the bombing of Dresden. I believe the 75th anniversary was a few years ago. Um, but yeah, it's very interesting. Now, you know, as a major center, for Nazi Germany's rail and road network, you know, Dresden's destruction was really intended to overwhelm German authorities and services and clog all transportation routes with throngs of refugees, as well as striking fear. And that's another point. We didn't really discuss this earlier, but that's another point. Dresden was a transportation center, and that makes it useful for Germany, very useful for the war effort. Um, and it's another reason that you can argue that the Allies were justified in bombing Dresden. I still think it's very, very, debatable. But Again, the fact that it's a transportation network, the fact that it was used to transport wars supplies from one part of the country to another, it makes it very debatable. Um, and it was not just used, but it was a major center, for Nazi Germany's rail and road network. And the Allied assault came less than a month, after some 20,000 troops, were killed. U.S. troops, by the way, were killed in Germany's last-ditch offensive at the Battle of the Bulge. And 3 weeks after, the grim discovery of, the atrocities by Nazis at Auschwitz, in an effort to force a surrender, the Dresden bombing was intended to terrorize, like I said earlier, the civilian population locally and nationwide. And it did really have that effect. People were scared. Like I said about this, the soldiers or the officers, they went down into the bunkers. When they came up, the city was destroyed. And Dresden was really a city that many Germans felt really proud about. Many Germans felt really nationalistic. They felt really proud about Dresden because it really represented, German culture, German history, the classical German, architecture, and many, many Germans felt really proud. Like I said earlier, it was one of the most beautiful cities in Germany and in, Europe at the time. And many Germans took offense to the bombing, but the fact that but Germany wasn't strong enough at the time to respond in a major, major way and come back and actually win, the war. Um, but the German public was really shocked when Dresden was bombed, and once it was bombed, a lot of people lost a lot of hope, for the war, and they didn't think that it was possible anymore to win the war. Um, After Dresden was bombed. But it's interesting still. Um, while Vonnegut describes he was hiding underground, he heard aircrafts dropping thousands of flares and bombs. And, 500 heavy bomber planes, flew over at a time, loaded with explosives, and they just came over and they dropped them all. And, with the German Luftwaffe destroyed and anti-aircraft defenses in shambles, the Royal Air Force lost only 6 planes, which is incredible. The fact that over 500 planes flew over and only 6 went down just demonstrates how weak, the city's defense system was in Dresden. But yeah, that really, sums it up for the podcast. Um, yeah, it really does sum up for the podcast. Um, just to recap, we spoke about, the historical significance of Dresden to the German people, along with, whether, and we debated, well, I debated, and I gave both sides, whether the Allies were justified in bombing Dresden or not. It's an interesting conversation. It's very debatable, and that's why, it's such a popular topic, and it's spoken about so much. But yeah, thank you for listening to the podcast, and I hope you listen to many more again in the future. Goodbye.